Good morning, friends. I'm sorry not to be with you in person today, but we thought it would be a good idea for me to pre-record today's sermon because at any moment we are expecting to hear from our son and daughter-in-law in Petaluma, where they are expecting the birth of their first child, our first grandchild. And the birth of a child always seems like a miracle, doesn't it? I've got to say, it feels a little like a miracle that our son is now old enough to have a child. But he has become a wonderful adult, loving and capable, truly ready to be a father. So what a delight that today we get to talk about miracles. But I want to begin by acknowledging that there are times when hearing these stories about miraculous physical healings can be hard for some of us to hear. There are parents in our parish family who have lost children, and my heart aches for them. I pray that hearing today's gospel brings maybe some comfort and an understanding that the greatest miracle of all is that God is always present with us, both in times of death and despair and in times of healing and rejoicing. The greatest healing, surely, is finding peace in one's soul. I also recognize that in our day, there may be some skepticism about Jesus' miraculous healings. How can those healings have happened? Our post-Enlightenment scientific analyzing brains may be questioning. But there are so many stories like these about Jesus' ministry of healing. And they attest to the fact that in his time, he was acclaimed as someone with extraordinary gifts and powers. And personally, I am happy to not be a skeptic. If Jesus was who I believe he was and is, I have no doubt that he could heal bodies as well as healing souls. And clearly the people in his day believed in his healing powers. Do you remember the first line of today's gospel? It says, "When Jesus had crossed again in a boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him." And then just after his first conversation with Jairus, again we hear, "And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him." Jesus was constantly surrounded by crowds. They wanted to listen to his preaching about the kingdom of God, but also, often, they were there in hopes to be healed themselves or to watch and witness as he healed others. Now, the two stories we hear today tell us that Jesus included everyone in his healing ministries, for the two main individuals in this gospel could not have been more different. First, we hear about Jairus. He's a man, so he automatically has a place of privilege and power. As one of the leaders of the synagogue, he's an important public figure in Jewish society. He's probably a man of some wealth, certainly a man of honor. And notice that his name is remembered all these thousands of years later. And then we have the woman who had been suffering with hemorrhages for many years. She was not given the honor of having her name mentioned. Instead, she is identified by her illness, an illness that makes her both physically weak and that places her in a position of weakness in society. We know that she is poor because she spent whatever money she had on physicians who were unable to make her well. And because of her illness, she is considered by the religious laws of the day to be unclean. And note the contrast of the religious synagogue leader Jairus and a woman because of her perceived impurity would not even have been permitted inside the synagogue. She was condemned to a life of isolation. For if someone else were to touch her or even be touched by her, they would become ritually unclean as well. So this poor woman she would have lived separated from the synagogue, from village life, and probably even from her own family. And worse yet, in Jesus' day, physical and mental ailments in adults were most often seen either as the result of sin or as the work of evil spirits. Now, in other gospel accounts we have, it is clear that Jesus disagreed with that belief that illness came from sin, but it was the prevailing understanding of the day. So the buzz on this poor woman might well have been, oh, she must be a sinner, or there must be a reason that an evil spirit was drawn to her. She is no good. So because of her condition, the rest of the villagers would have gone out of their way to avoid her. And so as an outcast, her physical pain and suffering would have had a constant companion in terrible loneliness. We all know how lonely it can feel when we're sick, don't we? So imagine if on top of that sense of isolation, you were completely shunned. The only time people would look at you would be to judge you with disdain, saying, hey, you must deserve to be sick and suffering. Yet for all their differences, for all in society that separated them, both Jairus and the unnamed woman have one thing in common. They both believe that Jesus has the power to heal. The gospel passage begins and ends with the story of Jairus and his daughter. This man of power and authority recognizes that when it comes to saving his daughter's life, it is Jesus who has the authority. So he falls at the feet of Jesus. He begs repeatedly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands upon her so that she may be made well and live. Imagine the reaction of the crowd to see this demonstration of faith and humility as Jairus humbles himself before Jesus. But there's something else going on here too. Again, something having to do with the laws of religious ritual purity that were so important in that time. By asking Jesus to lay his hands upon his daughter, the synagogue leader is also asking Jesus to take an action that will make Jesus ritually impure. A religious leader, a rabbi like Jesus, could not touch the body of someone who was at the point of death. Afterwards, Jesus would need to go through elaborate and lengthy cleansing rituals to become pure again himself. But Jesus does not hesitate to help because he understands that real purity is about purity of heart. Jesus would say that God's mercy demands his helping, and his own ministry is always and always about demonstrating God's mercy. So Jesus responds by offering to help, and he sets off with Jairus to the religious leader's home. But before he gets there, we hear yet another story about God's mercy. The woman comes up behind Jesus. She touches the fringe of his garment, saying to herself, if I only touch his cloak, I will be made well. What faith and what chutzpah. No one back then understood the medical realities of why a woman would be bleeding for so long. Clearly, the physicians of the day had offered no help. We heard she had endured much under many physicians and had spent all she had, and she was no better. But she has faith that Jesus can end her suffering. And that's what happens gloriously as she reaches out, as she makes contact with just the cloak that Jesus is wearing. Immediately, we are told, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And how does Jesus respond? We hear, immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? Now, I love the reaction of the disciples. Can't you just hear them as they urge him on to Jairus' house? Come on, Jesus. You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, who touched me? Let's keep going. And imagine poor Jairus, whose daughter is at the point of death. He must have been in anguish when Jesus stops to ask, who touched my clothes? Really? But Jesus is not ready to move on. He knows that his power has healed someone. He knows that there is another immediate need to be heard, another soul in anguish here. And the woman, knowing what had happened to her, falls down before him. And we hear she told him the whole truth. I wonder, how I wonder if her whole truth included telling him not just of her physical suffering, but also of her deep heartache, perhaps even her shame at being an outcast, her pain in being so lonely for those 12 long years. Remember, this woman had been bleeding for 12 years. She was totally ritually unclean. She had absolutely no right to touch a rabbi, not even the fringe of his cloak. What could she have been thinking? And what is Jesus thinking? Jesus, it appears, is thinking once again of how God's mercy extends to all, most especially to outcasts and to those who've so long been separated from community. So in the midst of this crowd, with the urgency of moving on toward Jairus' home, Jesus stops to listen, to recognize her dignity, and to reassure her. He says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So Jesus once again does all the wrong things by the religious standards of his society for all the right reasons, to reveal a new understanding of God's standards. And finally, she has been given a name for us to remember. Jesus calls her daughter with a capital D. And because she has been restored to wholeness, she can now rejoin society by having the faith and the courage to reach out to Jesus. She has touched and been touched by the loving mercy of God. We could just sit in quiet wonder at the gift Jesus has given her, recognizing her worthiness, making the time to listen to her, restoring her to wholeness in so many ways. But wait, we're not done. There is another miracle to come, another daughter to be saved. Now, while he was speaking to the woman, we learn that some people came from the leader's house to tell Jairus, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Imagine Jairus' heartache. They're too late. But Jesus has overheard what had been told to Jairus, and he tells the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." So Jesus and Jairus now continue on their way to the synagogue leader's home, and then when Jesus arrives, he tells the noisy mourners to go away. They can stop their funeral dirges because he tells them, the little girl isn't dead, she's only sleeping. Their reaction is not so surprising. They laugh scornfully at him. Of course she's dead. Even her father had been told that she was dead by then. Jesus casts them outside. He takes the child's father and mother and his closest disciples to go into where the little girl lay. The sadness, the heartache that must have been in that room. But Jesus takes the little girl by the hand, and then speaking to her in his native Aramaic, he says, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And she does. Immediately, we hear, the little girl got up and she began to walk about. And we're told she was 12 years of age. That detail about her age reminds us that this little girl was as old as the 12 years that the woman who had been ill had been suffering. Again, we should not be surprised to hear the parents are overcome with amazement. And then what does Jesus do? Jesus simply tells them, give her something to eat. Give her something to eat. Eating, touching the hem of a garment. Such simple acts but all caught up in miracles. And most importantly, caught up in God's mercy. And Jesus wasn't offering miracles that day to make a name for himself. In fact, he very specifically ordered them not to tell anyone about what he had done for their child. And yet the report of the miracles spreads. Both of these stories are told and retold until we hear them again this morning. Miracles, miracles. Now, you may not have experienced a miracle of physical healing in your life, but I wonder, have you ever felt lonely, isolated? I know that during these past many, many months of the pandemic, some of you suffered terribly from that loneliness. I also know that others in this community have reached out in phone calls and cards and Zoom calls to ease that pain. Could we call that a small miracle? It's surely a sign of mercy, human mercy and God's mercy. Have you ever been in such despair that it felt like you were dying? And then later realized that you came to a place of peace, almost as if you had been raised up to a new life. I'd call that a miracle. Have you ever needed someone to listen to the whole truth of your life? To just let you tell your story? And if they took the time to listen deeply, did the sense of relief and understanding feel like a gift? Perhaps even like a small miracle. Now, if you were to tell a story about God's mercy in your life, what would it be? Please spend some time pondering that question, recognizing the gift of God's mercy in your life. And perhaps you will recognize a time when you were the one extending God's mercy, reaching out to someone whom others may have scorned, welcoming someone who is lonely into an embrace of community, lifting up someone who was in dark despair. I invite you to share those stories, maybe over coffee hour today, or with me when I return with you. Or maybe best of all, with someone in the coming week who needs to hear a story of encouragement, a story of how God's mercy has touched your life and then might touch theirs. I am so certain that you have some amazing, perhaps miraculous stories to share. May God bless the storytelling.